It started with silence, not the kind you find in quiet mornings or empty fields, but a deep, crushing silence that swallows sound, thought, and reason. I remember standing outside the old cabin, my flashlight beam trembling against the fog, and realizing that the forest wasn't asleep. It was listening. My name's Daniel Moore, 34 years old, born and raised in the mountains of western North Carolina. I'd camped, hunted, hiked, and fished these woods my entire life. I thought I knew them, thought I respected them. But that night in the Nantahala changed the way I look at the wilderness forever. It was mid-October, just before the first frost. I'd rented a remote cabin deep within the Nantahala National Forest, an old structure from the 1940s, once used by fire watchers. The owner, an older man from Bryson City, handed me the keys and said something strange before I left. If you hear tapping on the walls, don't go looking. Just wait till morning. I laughed it off. Locals always had stories, and I'd heard them all. Lights moving between the trees, voices mimicking friends, patterns left in the dirt that weren't there before nightfall. I wasn't there for ghosts. I was there to clear my head. To spend a weekend without reception, without traffic, without the constant hum of people needing something from me. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a stream. Its roof sagged slightly, and the porch leaned, but it was sturdy enough. I spent the first day chopping firewood, hiking down the slope to the water, and cooking canned beans over a small flame. The sun fell early behind the ridges, and when night came, it was the kind of black that feels solid. You could almost reach out and touch it. I remember lying in bed, the firelight painting orange shapes on the ceiling, listening to the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful until it wasn't. At exactly 2:22 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why. My body just knew. The kind of alertness you get when you sense you're being watched. The fire had burned low, just a few red coals breathing in the dark. Then came the sound, a faint clack, like stones striking stone. Once, then again, steady, deliberate, not an animal, not a tree creaking. A rhythm, clack, 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 coming from outside the cabin walls. I sat up, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. At first, I thought it was someone playing a prank. Maybe hunters or hikers lost in the woods, but no one should have been there. I stepped quietly to the window, peered through the glass, and saw nothing but fog. It was thick that night, almost silver under the sliver of moonlight. I could barely make out the outline of the trees, but there was movement. Something low, gliding between them, too smooth to be human, too slow to be an animal running. I felt my throat tighten. That's when the tapping began, soft, like knuckles brushing the wood from outside. One side of the cabin, then another, then the back. A circle. I grabbed my flashlight and unlatched the door. I don't know why I did it. Maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity. But the second the door creaked open, the tapping stopped. I stepped out into the cold night air, my breath clouding before me, the silence pressing on my ears. The ground was damp from earlier rain, and the forest floor gleamed faintly. I swept the beam around. No footprints, no figures, just fog. I walked around the cabin once, scanning every inch. Nothing. But as I came back around the front, something caught the light. Stones. Small, river-smoothed stones arranged in a perfect circle around the cabin, each one placed exactly a foot apart. They hadn't been there before. I'd walked that ground earlier barefoot, feeling only dirt and pine needles. My stomach turned as I realized how precise it was. Too precise. Like someone had measured it out, stone by stone, in silence, while I slept. I crouched down and picked one up. It was cold, colder than it should have been, like it had come straight from the stream. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the beam flashed across something in the fog. Two shapes, standing side by side between the trees. Not close, but close enough to see that they weren't moving. Watching. I dropped the stone and backed toward the door, my pulse thudding against my ribs. When I turned to look again, the shapes were gone. Just missed. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire, trying to slow my breathing. Every instinct told me not to go back to sleep. The owner's words rang in my head. If you hear tapping on the walls, don't go looking. I stayed awake until dawn. The circle of stones burned into my mind, afraid to even blink. Morning brought a different kind of terror. The fog had lifted, the sun slanted through the trees, and for a moment I convinced myself it had been a dream. I stepped outside to prove it. The circle was still there, every stone perfectly placed, untouched. But what chilled me wasn't the stones, it was what was inside the circle. My boot prints from the night before had been erased. The soil was smooth, undisturbed except for the stones. No trace that I had ever walked there. I spent the morning packing up, deciding I'd had enough wilderness for one trip. But as I loaded the truck, I heard it again, the clack, faint and distant, echoing from somewhere deeper in the woods. I told myself it was just rocks shifting in the stream. I wanted to believe that. But as I reached the end of the dirt road, I glanced back at the ridge, and for a split second I saw the cabin's shadow against the trees and something standing beside it. Tall. Still, as if waiting for me to leave. That night, back in town, I showed the cabin owner the photos I'd taken. The circle of stones was clear, the symmetry undeniable. He looked at them, said nothing for a long while, then closed the laptop and handed it back to me. "You stayed there in October?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He sighed, looking out the window toward the mountains. "You know, back before the forest took over that ridge, there used to be a Cherokee burial ground up there. They say the stones mark places the spirits protect. Circles mean you've stepped into something you weren't meant to see." I didn't go back. Not for years. But the image never left me. The fog, the stones, the silence that followed. It wasn't until much later, on another trip, that I realized what that circle really meant. It wasn't a warning. It was a boundary. A way of saying, "We know you're here, stay inside." Because maybe, just maybe, what was outside that night wasn't trying to harm me. It was keeping something else from getting in. And sometimes when the wind moves just right and I catch that familiar scent of wet pine and smoke, I still hear it. That faint clack, clack, clack somewhere far off in the hills. I don't run from it anymore. I listen. Because some lessons the wilderness teaches you don't come in the daylight. They come when you're alone, at 2:22 in the morning, staring at a circle of stones that wasn't there before, and realizing the forest has eyes, and it never really sleeps. For weeks after I left Nantahala, I couldn't shake it. The sound, the stillness, the perfect symmetry of that circle. Every night I'd wake up at almost the exact same time, 2:22 a.m., and stare at the shadows in my room, waiting for the sound of stone against stone. Nothing ever came, but the silence was worse. I kept thinking about what the old man said, about boundaries, about things that weren't meant to be crossed. I'd always thought of the forest as a place of escape, a refuge from noise and people and expectation. But that night, I realized something I'd never truly understood before. The wilderness doesn't belong to us. We only borrow it. I started digging into the history of that ridge, reading everything I could find. Most of it was old folklore, whispers passed through generations. The Cherokee called that area Tsulawatsi, the land where the fox walks in circles. Some stories said it was a place where the veil between the living and the dead thins each autumn when the fog lingers low and the stones sweat with cold. The old people said if you were chosen to see the circle, it meant you'd stepped where the spirits kept watch. Not cursed, not blessed, just marked. Watched. I didn't know if I believed that. But after a while, belief didn't matter, because the forest had shown me something I couldn't explain, and explanations didn't make it less real. I tried to move on, focused on work, relationships, the routines that anchor most people. But every time I heard wind against glass or the sound of pebbles rolling down a driveway, I was back there, standing barefoot in the dark, staring at that ring of stones that hadn't been there before. Fear isn't always a scream. Sometimes it's a memory that refuses to fade. One evening, about 6 months later, I decided to go hiking again. Not in Nantahala too soon for that, but farther east near Linville Gorge. I packed light. No music, no distractions. I wanted to face that quiet again to see if I could make peace with it. The first night out, I camped near a stream, the air crisp and sharp with pine. As I lay in my tent, I felt it, that same hush creeping in, the kind that presses against your ribs. I froze for a moment, expecting the tapping, the clack. But instead, I heard something different. The wind carried a faint voice, low and steady, almost like a chant. It wasn't English, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt old, protective. That's when it hit me. Maybe fear isn't the enemy. Maybe fear is the language the wild uses to make sure you're listening. It's not there to paralyze you. It's there to remind you that you're alive and that you're small. In the city, people talk about conquering nature, surviving it, mastering it. But out there alone, under a sky so dark it swallows the stars, you learn that survival isn't about mastery, it's about respect. When I finally returned to Nantahala a year later, it wasn't to test anything. It was to say thank you. The road up to the cabin was rougher than before, washed out by storms, overgrown with wild grass. The place looked smaller, older, like it had been waiting. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I felt that same pulse in the air, like the forest knew me, remembered me. I walked slowly around the cabin, half afraid, half reverent, and there they were, the stones, still there, weathered now, moss growing between them, but the circle remained perfect. I stood at its edge for a long time. I didn't cross it this time. I didn't disturb it. I just stood there, breathing in the cold, damp scent of mountain air, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel watched. I felt included, as if the forest had finally accepted that I understood, that boundaries weren't meant to divide, they were meant to protect both sides. Before I left, I placed one more stone, smooth, flat from the creek below the circle's edge, not to complete it, but to acknowledge it, a small gesture of respect to something older, deeper, and wiser than I'll ever be. Driving down the mountain that afternoon, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The ridge was fading into mist, and the sun cut through the fog like a blade. And right then, I realized something I'd never been able to put into words before. The forest isn't haunted by what we fear. It's haunted by what we forget. We forget to listen. We forget to ask. We forget that every fire we light, every path we carve, every cabin we build is a whisper into something far larger than ourselves. That night, when I got home, I didn't wake at 2:22 a.m. For the first time in months, I slept through till dawn. And maybe that's the lesson the Nantahala wanted me to learn. Not about ghosts or curses, but about humility. About knowing when to stand inside the circle and when to leave it untouched. Because sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't what's out there waiting for you. It's realizing that you were the intruder all along. The forest teaches in whispers, not words. And if you stay long enough, quiet enough, you begin to understand its language. It speaks through shifting leaves, through the rhythm of rain on bark, through the silence that lingers after something unseen moves away. When I think back to that night in Nantahala, the stones, the fog, the stillness, I don't remember fear the way I used to. I remember awareness. I remember the pulse of something ancient moving through the ground beneath my feet, reminding me that every step in the wild is borrowed time. Most people who venture deep into the woods think they're searching for peace, but peace isn't the same as comfort. Out there, you're stripped bare, no noise to drown your thoughts, no walls to keep the dark away. The forest shows you what's left when all that's gone. It's humbling, terrifying, beautiful. That's what I learned the night the cabin was surrounded by that perfect circle of stones. Fear isn't there to drive you out. It's there to show you the edge of your understanding. And sometimes you need to stand on that edge to feel alive. I've told this story 100 times to other campers, hikers, drifters who think the mountains are theirs to conquer. They smile, they nod, they laugh at the parts that make them uneasy. But the truth is, it's not a story meant to scare. It's a story meant to remind. Because every person who's ever set foot in the Appalachian woods has felt it, that quiet sense that you're being observed, not threatened, but measured. Like the wilderness is asking a question, do you belong here, or are you just passing through? That question never leaves you. It follows you in the way tree shadows stretch across a trail at dusk, or how the mist curls through your campsite right before dawn. You start to understand that what you call silence isn't silence at all. It's conversation, the world speaking back. The trick is learning when to answer and when to simply listen. I still go back to Nantahala sometimes, not to the same cabin, but close. I camp by the streams, let the cold water bite at my hands, and watch the sun dissolve behind the ridges. I don't build large fires anymore. I don't play music. I keep it quiet, respectful, because I know now that the forest doesn't need your noise. It needs your presence. There's a difference. Sometimes late at night, when the world feels still again, I'll walk the edge of the woods and look for circles in the soil, patterns made by wind, by animals, or maybe by something older, still keeping watch. I never cross them. I nod, step back, and let them be. And in those moments, I feel something I can't quite explain. Not safety, not fear, just belonging. Like I've finally learned the rhythm of the place. If you ever find yourself deep in those mountains, past where the trail ends, past where your signal fades, listen closely. The woods there don't welcome noise, but they do recognize respect. They notice how you move, how you breathe, how you treat what's around you. That's how they decide whether to show you their secrets. And if you're lucky, or maybe unlucky, they might just remind you that you're not alone. When I close my eyes now, I still see that circle. Stones cold and perfect, glistening with fog. I see the cabin light flickering through the mist. I see the trees tall and still, waiting. But most of all, I feel gratitude. Because that night, when everything in me wanted to run, I stayed. I listened, and in doing so, I learned something I'll carry for the rest of my life. That fear is not the opposite of peace. It's the doorway to it. That the forest is not a backdrop for our stories. It is the story. And that every whisper, every stone, every shadow has a purpose, if you have the patience to listen long enough. So the next time you're out there, far from the city lights, and the night grows heavy with silence, don't rush it. Don't fill it. Let it surround you. Let it remind you that you are small and that being small is sacred. Because somewhere out there, under that same black sky, the mountains remember every voice that ever dared to speak too loudly, every fire that burned too bright, every human who forgot to listen. And if you ever wake at 2:22 a.m. to the sound of something gentle and steady in the dark, stone striking stone, don't panic. Sit still, breathe, and know that the forest hasn't come to harm you. It's come to remind you that you're never really alone out there. You're simply being seen. Because the wilderness keeps its own kind of watch. And sometimes the most terrifying thing about it is how deeply it still cares. Imagine the camera fading to black, then slowly rising over a sea of trees, the endless green and gray waves of the Appalachian Mountains. The mist moves like something alive, curling between the ridges as if it remembers every name ever whispered through it. A soft wind carries the echo of water moving over stone. And then beneath that quiet, a voice, steady, low, the sound of someone who's seen too much to ever call the forest just nature again. You speak not to frighten, but to awaken. Because these stories, the ones carved into bark and buried beneath moss, aren't warnings. They're invitations. The wilderness doesn't hunt you. It humbles you. It strips away the noise, the bravado, the illusion that you are in control. Out here, there are no walls, no masks, no second chances, just you, your heartbeat, and whatever waits beyond the firelight. And maybe that's why we keep coming back. We come not to escape the world, but to remember it. To feel the pulse of something ancient in our bones. To stand under a sky so wide it could swallow you whole and realize that every breath you take is a gift borrowed from a world that does not need you, but still allows you to stay. The screen flickers with faint embers, remnants of a campfire dying slow. You hear the faint rhythm again, clack, clack, clack. Not menacing this time, but steady, almost like a heartbeat syncing with your own. The voice continues, quiet, reverent. In the Nantahala, I learned that fear is a teacher dressed in fog, that respect is the only compass worth carrying, and that some circles are not meant to be broken, only understood. The stones weren't there to keep me in. They were there to keep the world out. To remind me that peace isn't found by taming the wild, It's found by surrendering to it. A pause, the sound of wind through hollow pines, then softer. So if you ever find yourself out there, deep enough that the air feels heavy and the trees seem to lean in close, remember this. When the forest grows silent, it's not empty, it's listening. And when you feel that pull in your chest, that strange blend of fear and wonder, don't run from it. That's the mountain's way of speaking your name. The fog thickens across the screen. The camera pans slowly down a dark trail, the same one that led to the cabin. The stones glimmer faintly in the mist, still there after all this time. The voice fades, one last breath against the quiet. Because every path has its watchers, every fire has its witness, and every story the woods allow you to tell comes with a price. But if you walk gently, if you listen more than you speak, you'll leave with something far more valuable than safety. A final beat of silence, then you'll leave with the forest's respect. The sound fades entirely now, only the whisper of fog against pine. The circle of stones glows faintly under moonlight. The timestamp burns into the black, Nantahala Forest, 2:22 a.m. Then one last echo, barely audible beneath the closing music. Clack, clack, clack. And the screen cuts to black. I remember that night, like it branded itself into the marrow of my bones. The kind of night that changes the way you look at silence. My name's Aaron Miles, 34 years old, born and raised in the hills of Virginia. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail since I was a kid, knew how to read tree lines before I could read a book. But there are some things out here no compass can prepare you for. Some nights, no matter how familiar the woods seem, you feel something ancient watching you, something that remembers this land better than you do. That evening, the fog had rolled down from the Blue Ridge like spilled milk, thick and slow, swallowing the valley below. I'd set up camp along Laurel Fork, deep in Highland County, a stretch where the trees grow tight together and the wind hums through their hollow bones. I wasn't out there for thrill or solitude. I was chasing stillness, trying to shake loose a weight I couldn't name. Work had been eating at me. The city felt like a cage, and the woods, they were supposed to be my cure. But that night reminded me that nature doesn't cure, it reveals. The first hours were peaceful in the way only the Appalachians can be. The sound of the stream brushing past stones, the rhythm of crickets, and the faint rustle of leaves shifting in their sleep. I sat by the fire, wrapped in the orange breath of flame, writing in my journal about how alive everything felt. I remember noting how the mist seemed alive too, curling and pulsing just beyond the firelight. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. that I noticed the woods had gone quiet. Not just quiet, but void. The frogs stopped singing. The wind went still. Even the fire seemed to shrink, as if afraid to breathe. That kind of silence doesn't happen for no reason. If you've spent enough nights outdoors, you know that when the forest goes mute, it's because something's moving. Maybe a bear, maybe a coyote, maybe something else. I stood, flashlight in hand, and swept it across the tree line. White beams sliced through the mist, catching droplets like falling stars, but there was nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no movement, no sound. And yet, I felt it. A presence, thick and patient, just beyond the reach of light. I tried to shake it off. Fear can play tricks when you're alone, and the mind loves to fill the dark with stories. I sat back down, threw another log on the fire, and told myself it was nothing. But when I crawled into my tent an hour later, the feeling followed me in like a shadow that didn't want to let go. The wind picked up again, slow, deliberate, whispering through the trees in long, drawn-out breaths. I closed my eyes, listening, counting the rhythm of it when a sound cracked through the night that didn't belong to the wind. Knock, knock, knock. 3 dull, deliberate taps against something hollow. Wood, I thought. Close. Too close. My tent zipper rattled under my hand as I froze. The knocks came again, sharper this time. I reached for the hatchet lying beside my sleeping bag and whispered into the dark, "Who's there?" No answer. Only the whisper of mist crawling around the canvas. Then silence again. I waited, every nerve strung tight, until I couldn't stand it anymore. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The fog was thick, like I was staring into milk. The fire had burned down to embers. I stepped out, slow, the air cold enough to bite the inside of my nose. That's when I saw it, a faint shape at the edge of the firelight. A person, maybe. Tall, still, facing me. I called out again, voice low, "Hey, you lost?" Nothing. No movement, no sound. I took a step closer, but the fog swallowed them whole, dissolving their shape into nothing. And when I got to where they had been standing, I stopped cold. The ground was soft, still damp from yesterday's rain. But there were no footprints. None. Not leading in, not leading out. The forest held its breath as I scanned the ground again, desperate for logic. Maybe I missed them. Maybe they were barefoot. Maybe, but the mud was untouched, smooth as glass. I backed away, slow, the firelight flickering behind me, and that's when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time from the other side, near the stream. I spun, flashlight slicing through the mist, catching nothing but branches. My breath came out sharp, visible in the beam. That sound wasn't random. It wasn't echo. It was deliberate, a rhythm with intent behind it. I'd heard woodpeckers, branches breaking, deer hooves on bark, but this was someone knocking, and they were moving. My instincts kicked in. I retreated toward my tent, grabbed my pack, and killed the lantern. Total darkness fell over the site, and I crouched by the dying fire, listening. The knocks came again, fainter now, moving uphill, fading into the trees until they vanished altogether. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours before I finally exhaled. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, gripping the hatchet, waiting for dawn to burn through that fog. When the first light finally seeped through the trees, it felt like I'd survived something invisible. I walked around the site, tracing the perimeter, searching again for prints. There were mine, scattered all around the tent and the fire pit, but none leading toward the stream. None near the logs where the knocking came from. The mud still glistened wet, unbroken. I packed up early, breaking camp before the sun fully climbed the ridge. The woods looked different in daylight, smaller, tamer, harmless. But as I followed the trail back to the truck, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A tree trunk, smooth and dark, with 3 fresh marks, small indents, evenly spaced, as if something hard had tapped it 3 times. That was when the fear turned to unease. This wasn't about ghosts or legends, it was about presence. Something had been there, something that understood rhythm, patience, and silence better than any person should. I left Highland County that morning feeling both foolish and grateful. Foolish for thinking I understood the woods. Grateful that whatever knocked that night decided to stop. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a friend of mine, Luke, a ranger who worked in the same stretch of forest. He'd found a campsite abandoned not far from where I'd been. Tent collapsed, food left out, fire still warm. No sign of the campers, just 3 marks on a nearby tree. Even he didn't want to talk about it much after that. People say the mountains hold old spirits, not evil, not kind, just ancient. Maybe they're memories of the land, echoes of things that walked these hills long before us. Maybe they test those who wander too deep to remind us that we don't belong everywhere our boots can reach. I've camped hundreds of nights since then, but never again in Highland County. I still love the woods, still trust them, but I move with a kind of reverence now. When the wind dies and the forest holds its breath, I don't ask questions anymore. I just listen. Because sometimes the silence isn't empty at all. Sometimes it's waiting for a knock. And if you ever find yourself camping near Laurel Fork and the night goes suddenly still, don't wait to hear it. Don't call out. Don't go looking for footprints. Just listen. And remember that not everything that finds you in the dark wants to be found. I left Highland County with the windows down, the cold air cutting through the cab of my truck like a cleansing blade. But the farther I drove from those woods, the less relief I felt. You can leave a place behind, but not everything that happens there lets you go. It clings, invisible, to your breath and to your thoughts, following you like a shadow that no longer needs the sun. I kept telling myself it was exhaustion, maybe a trick of the fog, maybe even the remnants of a bad dream. But deep down, I knew better. For weeks after that night, sleep came in fragments, shallow, restless. Every time the world outside my window fell silent, I'd wake, heart pounding, waiting for that sound again. That dull, hollow rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. It was as if the woods had left an imprint on my nerves, tuning me to its hidden frequency. I'd wake before dawn, check the locks, walk barefoot through my apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, just to remind myself I was somewhere human. I didn't tell anyone at first, not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because part of me didn't want to speak it aloud. Words have power, especially when it comes to fear. Saying it makes it real again. And I was tired of being afraid of something I couldn't name. But fear has its own gravity. It doesn't fade. It settles in, quietly reshaping who you are. About a month later, I got an invitation to join a small group on a winter hike along the George Washington National Forest, a route that brushed just south of Highland County. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed no, but curiosity is its own kind of curse. I told myself I couldn't let one strange night keep me from the thing I loved most. That's how fear wins, by narrowing the borders of your life until you can't move freely inside it anymore. So I said yes. We set out early that morning. Me, Luke the ranger, and 2 of his friends from the Forestry Service. The air was thin and sharp, and frost coated the edges of the trail like glass dust. The woods were different in winter, stripped bare, honest. You can see farther, but somehow that makes it worse. There's no place for things to hide, which means if something is out there, you'll see it. You just might wish you hadn't. Around midday, we stopped by an old logging road, half swallowed by vines and snow. Luke mentioned that this was near where they'd found that abandoned campsite. He said it casually, but I saw his jaw tighten as he looked up the ridge. He didn't believe in stories, not officially, but the silence that followed his words told me he remembered the same unease I did. We decided to set up camp there before dusk. The others went to gather wood while I unpacked the gear, trying not to notice the way the forest seemed to lean inward as the light faded. When the fire was lit and the night took hold, that familiar rhythm of crackling logs and distant owls started to calm me. For the first time in weeks, I felt almost normal, until Luke froze mid-sentence, eyes fixed on something behind me. He didn't say a word. He just raised a hand slowly, signaling for quiet. The others turned, and then we heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Not loud, not close, just deliberate. A sound too precise to be random. Luke stood, flashlight ready, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Probably a branch, he whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. The sound came again, this time farther down the slope. Knock, knock, knock. The same rhythm, the same cadence that had chased me out of the fog that night. The others started calling out, trying to pinpoint the source, but I already knew they wouldn't find it. The sound moved like it had no body, no source, as if the woods themselves were knocking, one tree to another, and sending messages only they could understand. We didn't sleep that night. None of us. Around 3 a.m., the knocks stopped, and a faint wind rose, whistling through the frozen leaves. Luke swore under his breath and threw more wood on the fire, his face pale and tight. "You said you camped near here last time," he murmured. I nodded. "Did it sound like that?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared into the fire, watching the flames twist into shapes that looked almost human before breaking apart. "Exactly like that," I said finally. "Only this time, we're not alone to hear it." Morning came slow, gray, heavy with snow. We packed in silence, each of us lost in thought, pretending nothing had happened. But before we left, I walked to the edge of the camp and saw something that made my stomach knot. 3 fresh marks on a birch trunk, faint but unmistakable. Perfectly spaced. Too deliberate to be random. I didn't tell the others. What was there to say? Some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be respected. That's the thing about the Appalachian wilderness. It's not just scenery. It's alive in ways that defy reason. The locals in Highland County will tell you that certain hollows and ridges carry stories that go back before language. Times when the mountains spoke, and people learn to listen. There are places where echoes repeat, not because of physics, but because something ancient wants to be remembered. It took me months to understand what that night truly meant. The knocking wasn't a threat, it was a warning, a reminder. When you walk into the wild, you're not entering empty land. You're entering someone else's home. You're borrowing space that's older than your lineage, older than your understanding. And if you forget that, if you treat the forest like a playground or a stage for your bravado, it will remind you that humility isn't optional out there. It's survival. Since that winter, I've returned to the mountains many times, but differently. I carry less, I walk slower, and I listen more. Sometimes, when the night turns thick and the wind dies, I sit by the fire and close my eyes. I hear the faintest rhythm in the distance, and instead of fear, I feel gratitude. Because that sound, that haunting, hollow knock, it's not a curse. It's an acknowledgement. It's the mountain saying, you're heard, you're seen, but don't forget where you stand. If you've ever camped alone, you know what it's like to feel small under a sky so big it humbles you. You know the beauty of silence, and how quickly that beauty can turn to dread. The difference between wonder and fear is razor thin in the wild. And maybe that's the lesson I was supposed to learn, that sometimes fear is just reverence misunderstood. To this day, when I meet other hikers, I tell them one thing: respect the stillness. Don't break it with noise or arrogance. Because when the woods go quiet, it's not just silence, it's attention. The forest is listening, deciding if you belong. And if it answers with a knock, don't run. Don't shout. Just listen. That's what I did on my last night out there this past spring. I camped near the Shenandoah line, far from any trail, deep enough that even cell service forgot my name. The night fell soft, gentle, the air thick with dew. I lay in my tent, half asleep, when it came faint but clear. Knock, knock, knock. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. I let it echo, fading into the distance. I whispered into the dark, I remember. And for the first time since Highland County, I felt peace. The forest wasn't haunting me anymore. It was greeting me. Maybe that's all fear really is. The echo of something we don't yet understand, asking to be remembered. And in the deep woods of the Appalachian Mountains, understanding comes slowly. But once it does, it never leaves you. Because the wild doesn't just test you, it teaches you. In whispers, in silence, and sometimes in 3 quiet knocks at 3:46 in the morning. There's a strange kind of honesty that only the wilderness can pull out of you, the kind that cities bury under schedules and streetlights. Out there, stripped of noise and comfort, you're just another heartbeat in a vast, breathing world. And that's where I finally understood why that night in Highland County had to happen. It wasn't a warning in the way I'd thought, not a threat meant to drive me out, but a connotation with something older than fear. Something that demanded humility, not panic. When you spend enough nights under the trees, you start to see that every sound has meaning. The whip of a branch in the wind, the scurry of small paws under leaves, the creak of old wood bending beneath the weight of time. They all speak, not to scare you, but to remind you that you're a guest here. I used to think survival was about strength, about knowing how to fight the cold, the dark, the things that move unseen. But now I know it's about listening, really listening to what the world is saying when it stops pretending to be harmless. I went back to Highland County this past summer, alone again. I didn't tell anyone, not even Luke. I didn't go to prove anything, not to conquer a fear, not to face a ghost. I went because something in me needed to stand there again, in the same soil, under the same fog, and acknowledge what had changed in me. I parked at the old Forest Service road and hiked 5 miles into the valley, retracing the trail as best I could from memory. The forest had shifted since then, trees fallen, trails swallowed by moss, but it still breathed that same heavy, ancient air. By sunset, I found what I thought was the old clearing. The stream still whispered nearby, threading through the stones like it had never left. I built a small fire, careful, quiet, each spark feeling like a conversation rather than an intrusion. The woods accepted it. No wind, no birds, just a gentle stillness, a kind of approval. I ate in silence, drank slow, and when the stars came out, I leaned back and watched them shimmer through the breaks in the canopy. At 3:46 a.m., that same cursed, sacred hour, I woke to a sound so soft I almost missed it. Knock, knock, knock. It came from behind me this time, faint, distant. I didn't move, didn't reach for a light. I just sat up and listened. The knocks didn't repeat. They didn't chase me or circle the camp like before. They echoed once and then faded to the creek's soft murmur. And that was enough. I whispered again, I remember. The woods didn't answer. They didn't need to. I think deep down, what we fear most isn't the unknown itself. It's the reflection it forces on us. Because when you're alone in the dark and everything around you feels alive and watching, the only thing louder than your heartbeat is your truth. Every regret, every lie, every failure echoes back at you in that silence. That's what I heard that first night. Not a stranger, not a spirit, but the echo of my own restlessness. The version of me that thought he could outrun the weight of his life by hiding in the wild. The mountains have a way of calling people like that. The restless ones, the broken ones, the ones looking for something they can't name. And when they answer, the mountains don't offer comfort. They offer revelation. It's not gentle and it's not kind. It's raw. It's real. It strips you down until you remember that life isn't about control. It's about respect. After that summer night, I stopped seeing the Appalachian wilderness as something to conquer or survive. I started seeing it as a mirror, vast and merciless but fair. Every campsite, every trail, every storm became a conversation. Sometimes it whispered lessons about patience, other times about pride. Sometimes it said nothing at all, and even that silence carried meaning. One autumn morning, I was hiking alone near Spruce Knob, the air cold enough to frost your breath. I met an old man on the trail, a local from Pendleton County. He carried a handmade walking stick and moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who'd walked that path 1,000 times. We talked for a while about the weather, about deer tracks, about how few people still came out that deep in the woods. Then, just before we parted ways, he looked at me and said, "You ever hear the woods knock back?" My breath caught. I didn't answer. He smiled, not a knowing smile, but a tired one. "Means they know your name now," he said softly. "Means you've been heard. Don't ever be afraid of that." That stayed with me, because maybe that's all I'd been given. Acknowledgement. Not friendship, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. And in a world that moves as fast and loud as ours does, being heard, even by the wilderness, feels sacred. I tell this story now not to scare anyone away from the woods, but to remind you what's really out there. Beneath the pine needles and the wind and the endless silence, there's memory. The land remembers everything. Every footstep, every voice, every spark of fire. It carries the weight of every soul that's ever crossed it. Some who respected it, some who didn't. And when it knocks, it's not to harm, it's to remind, to ask whether you still remember too. So if you ever find yourself camping out deep in those Appalachian valleys, far from the hum of roads and cell towers, take a moment to sit still. Let the night hold you. Feel the breath of the earth in the air around you. And if in that stillness you hear a faint knock, don't panic. Don't call out. Don't run. Just listen, because maybe, just maybe, the mountain is remembering your name. And if you're lucky, you'll learn the same thing I did, that fear and wonder are the same emotion wearing different masks. The woods only seem frightening when you forget they're alive. But once you remember, once you understand that every echo, every shadow, every knock is part of the same heartbeat, the fear turns to awe. When I left Highland County for the last time, the sun was rising through the fog, painting the ridges gold. I stopped on the roadside, stepped out, and looked back toward the tree line. The mist was thick, rolling, and alive, just like that first night. And as I watched it drift across the valley, I realized something simple but profound. I hadn't been haunted by that stranger. I'd been chosen to remember. Because some stories don't belong to people, they belong to the land. We just borrow them for a little while. And if the mountain ever knocks again at 3:46 a.m., I'll be ready. Not with fear, not with fire, but with silence, with respect, with understanding, because that's all the wilderness ever asks of us, to listen, to remember, and to never forget who's really walking beside us in the dark.